Sergeant Alex Hale had seen many things in his years as a soldier, but nothing quite like this. Aloran was a planet far from Earth, torn apart by years of endless war between two alien factions. His mission was clear: to help the survivors, to restore peace, and bring some stability to the planet. What he didn't expect, however, was to find two hungry, frightened alien twins, stranded in the middle of nowhere. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the barren landscape. Alex and his team had been patrolling a long-forgotten stretch of Aloran's surface, the terrain rough and desolate. His boots crunched over the dry earth, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. It wasn't exactly a place that screamed hope or recovery. But this was the reality the soldiers had to deal with. As Alex walked, keeping his weapon ready, his eyes scanned the horizon. That's when he spotted them, two small figures huddled together under a broken stone arch. At first, he thought they might be injured survivors, but when he got closer, he realized something was off. They were alien, not human. The creatures looked more like children than adults. Their skin a strange shade of violet, smooth and shiny under the sun. Their eyes, wide and uncertain, glowed softly in the dimming light. They were twin siblings, no more than 10 or 12 by human standards. But in terms of age for their species, they were still young. Their clothes were ragged, their bodies thin and frail. They looked terrified, as if they had no idea how to survive in a world that had long since lost its humanity. Alex's first instinct was to draw his weapon. He wasn't sure if they were hostile or just scared. He knew better than to trust anyone on Aloran, especially after so many hostile encounters with the local factions. But then he saw their eyes. Those eyes were full of confusion and hunger, not aggression. He lowered his rifle and stepped forward cautiously, speaking in a calm, steady voice, hoping they understood a little of the human language. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The twins flinched at the sound of his voice, shrinking back against the stone arch. They were scared, but they weren't hostile. Alex could tell they were exhausted, their bodies trembling with hunger. There was something innocent about them, something that stirred a deep protective instinct in him. He knew what he had to do. He opened his pack, pulling out a few energy bars, one of the few things his squad had brought with them that hadn't been consumed. He offered the bars to the twins, holding them out slowly so they wouldn't feel threatened at first. They only stared at the food, their eyes wide and unblinking. Then, one of them, Nera, he later learned, reached out, trembling, and took the bar. She sniffed it cautiously before nibbling at the edge. Kal, her brother, did the same. The simple act of offering food seemed to break the tension. They hadn't been hostile. They were just hungry. Alex watched them for a moment, making sure they were okay, then spoke again. "You need to eat. It's the only way you'll survive out here." Nera and Kal didn't say anything. Instead, they kept eating, their small hands shaking as they tore into the food. Alex didn't push them to talk. He simply stood there, letting them finish. He knew better than to rush things. After all, the twins had been alone in a hostile environment, and trust would take time. When they were done, Alex offered them water from his canteen, which they accepted gratefully. They didn't speak, but there was a visible shift in their demeanor. They seemed less fearful, more comfortable in his presence. As the silence stretched on, Alex realized something he hadn't expected. These twins weren't just survivors of a war. They were lost, alone, and completely inexperienced in the ways of the world. He couldn't just leave them out here. "Where are you from?" Alex asked, his voice gentle. He wasn't expecting a clear answer, but he needed to know. The twins exchanged a glance, their large eyes meeting in quiet understanding. Nera was the first to speak, her voice soft and uncertain. We don't know." Alex frowned. "You don't know?" Nera nodded. "We were taken. Taken by others like us. Then we escaped," Kal added, his voice a little more confident, though still shaky. "We don't know where we are now. It's scary." Alex's heart softened. The twins weren't the enemy. They weren't soldiers. They weren't invaders. They were just children lost in a strange world, struggling to survive. It was clear that they needed help. But what kind of help could he give them? "Well, I'm not leaving you here," Alex said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'll take you back to my camp. It's not safe out here, and you'll have a better chance of surviving with us." Nira and Kel nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of hope and uncertainty. They didn't speak, but their trust in him was clear. Slowly, they followed him as he started back toward his camp, the sounds of the wilderness surrounding them. The walk was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant cry of some unknown creature. The twins didn't ask many questions. They were too exhausted, still recovering from the shock of their ordeal. Alex kept a watchful eye on them, making sure they didn't fall behind or wander off by the time they reached the camp. The sun had set, casting long shadows over the makeshift tents. Alex's team had set up in a clearing, taking cover from the dangers of the planet's wild creatures. They weren't expecting any new arrivals, especially not alien children. But when they saw Alex returning with the twins in tow, they didn't question it. They knew better than to ask too many questions in times like these. Alex led the twins to a corner of the camp where a small fire crackled. Casting warmth and light over the area, he motioned for them to sit, and they did, their eyes never leaving him as if they were waiting for him to tell them what to do next. "Rest here," Alex said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'll get you something to eat and some blankets. You'll be safe here." Nira and Kel didn't move. They simply sat, watching Alex with a strange mixture of gratitude and curiosity. It was clear they had never encountered a human before, and they had no idea what to expect. But they trusted him, and that was enough for now. Alex returned to his tent, his mind racing. He wasn't sure how to handle this situation. He had been a soldier for most of his life, trained to fight, to survive, and to protect. But protecting two alien children was a different kind of challenge. He couldn't just fight for them. He needed to care for them, teach them, and make sure they survived in a world that was dangerous for anyone, let alone two inexperienced, vulnerable beings as he worked to prepare a meal for them. He thought about what it meant to be a protector. He had always viewed his duty as a soldier as something clear and straightforward: fight when necessary, protect when needed. But this was different. These twins weren't just victims of a war. They were survivors, just like him. And somehow, he had become their protector. When he returned with the food, the twins were still sitting by the fire. They didn't speak, but their eyes followed his every movement. Alex set the food down in front of them, watching as they looked at the small meal with quiet awe. "Eat," he said softly. "You'll need your strength." As the twins began eating, Alex sat beside them, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure what to expect from this strange new responsibility. But one thing was clear: his mission had just changed. He wasn't just here to help rebuild a war-torn planet. He was here to help these two lost souls find their way. The reactions from the banquet had caused a ripple that could not be ignored. Across the galaxy, from the core worlds to the outer colonies, news of the human dish, the steak of the sun, spread quickly. It was not the meal itself that caused the stir. It was the profound effect it had on every being who tasted it. A simple human meal had awakened something deep within the hearts of powerful alien species. And now the galaxy was beginning to change. Zillion, the Zarath scientist who had first felt the surge of emotion from the meal, was still reeling from his experience. In the quiet of his study aboard the Zarath flagship, he sat alone, gazing out at the stars. His mind kept returning to the same question. What had happened when he took that first bite of the human food? Why had it stirred emotions, he thought? Were lost forever? He was one of the galaxy's brightest minds, trained to think with cold logic. Emotion was something he had long discarded as unnecessary, a distraction from the pursuit of knowledge. But that night at the banquet, he had felt something he could not explain: a deep connection to others. The memories of his ancestors had flooded his mind, and along with them came feelings of compassion and understanding. Zillion had always been proud of his species' intellectual achievements, their ability to rise above emotional weakness. Yet the human dish had revealed to him something he had never considered. Perhaps intellect alone was not enough. The experience of connection, of shared understanding, had shaken him. And now he could not stop thinking about it. Back at the Zarath Council, Zelian attempted to explain the impact of the meal to his colleagues, but the other Zerath were skeptical. They had long prided themselves on their superior intellect and emotional control. The idea that a human meal could change the fundamental nature of their existence seemed ridiculous. But Zelian was persistent. He had to convince them that there was something more to this than just flavor and scent. The food is not just food, Zelian said during a council meeting. It carries something deeper, brings out something we have long suppressed: our emotions, our connection to others. We must study this further. There is power here. Power that could change the course of our future. But many of the Zerath, though intrigued, were still hesitant. To them, emotions were a weakness, not something to be embraced. Yet Zelian's words planted a seed of doubt. Was it possible that emotions long seen as irrelevant were more powerful than they had imagined? Far across the galaxy, the Corax were facing their own set of challenges. They had always prided themselves on their strength, their power, their ability to dominate any situation. The Corax warriors had never needed to rely on emotion. They were born to fight, to conquer, to win. But after the banquet, something had changed in the core of their being. Zarnok, the Corax warrior, who had taken his first bite of the human meal with skepticism, was struggling with a similar feeling. The warmth he had felt, the connection to others, was confusing. He had been raised to believe that only power mattered, that weakness was to be destroyed. But now, something inside him had shifted. Zarnok found himself thinking about the wars he had fought in, the countless lives he had taken. For the first time, he felt the weight of those actions. He could still hear the cries of his enemies in his mind, their voices haunting him. In a way, the human food had opened a door he had locked away in his heart, a door that led to remorse. Zarnok could not forget the taste of the steak of the sun. It had not just filled him physically. It had filled a deep, empty space inside him, a space he had never acknowledged before. He was no longer sure what he believed. Was strength really the only thing that mattered? Or was there something more, something he had overlooked his entire life? As days passed, more Corax warriors began to experience similar shifts in their thinking. They, too, had tasted the human meal, and like Zarnok, they had felt something inside them change. The idea of compassion, something they had always seen as a weakness, was now being reconsidered. What if there was more to power than brute force? What if the true strength of a warrior was not just in fighting, but in understanding and protecting others? These thoughts were unsettling for the Corax, who had always prided themselves on their single-minded pursuit of dominance. But slowly, their worldview began to shift. They were not the only ones. Meanwhile, on the VR and homeworld, VR and energy being named Kalter was contemplating the strange events unfolding in the galaxy. The VR had no physical bodies like the other species. They were beings of light and energy, able to exist without food or physical needs. Yet, as they observed the reactions of the other races, something inside them began to stir. Kalter had never experienced hunger or thirst. They had no need for the physical sustenance that other beings relied on. But as they watched the Zerath and Corax react to the human meal, Kalter began to feel an odd sensation. It was not hunger, but something like it, a longing for connection. The Viaran were ancient beings. Long removed from the struggles of other species, they had transcended the need for physical forms, choosing instead to exist as pure energy. And yet, the human food had sparked something in Kalter, a curiosity about the beings who still needed food, who still felt emotions. For the first time in millennia, Kalter questioned their own existence. Could their desire for transcendence be misplaced? Was there something more to life than eternal energy? Were the humans right? Was their value in the experience of connection? As news of the human dish spread across the galaxy, the ripple effects became undeniable. Species who had long been divided by war and suspicion were now questioning their beliefs. The cold logic of the Zerath, the fierce strength of the Corax, the detachment of the Viaranal were being challenged by the simplicity and power of the human meal. It was not just food. It was something Merit was a key to understanding the shared humanity that connected all beings. Regardless of their origins, some species were quick to embrace the change. The Ither, a species known for their artistic expressions, immediately began experimenting with human cooking techniques. eager to explore the emotions that could be conveyed through food. The Grill, a peaceful species from the outer colonies, sent a delegation to Earth to learn about human culture and share in the experience of eating together, but not all were ready to accept this shift. The Vornari, a militant species with a deep belief in the purity of tradition, saw the human influence as a threat. The Vornari had always relied on strict hierarchy and discipline. They viewed the emotional awakening caused by human food as a weakness, distraction from their goals. The Vornari leadership began to organize against the growing influence of humanity. They began to sabotage human trade routes, targeting ships carrying food and supplies. The Vornari believed that if they could stop the spread of human culture, they could preserve their way of life. But their efforts were not going unnoticed. The Zerath, who had been the first to feel the emotional power of the human meal, found themselves in a difficult position. They were torn between their long-standing tradition of logic and the newfound emotions that had been awakened in them. The Zerath knew they had to make a choice, continue with the old ways, or embrace the new path that had been revealed to them. As more and more species felt the impact of the human food, the galaxy found itself at a crossroads. The old order, built on power and dominance, was being replaced by something new, a desire for understanding, compassion, and unity. And at the heart of it all was a simple meal that had sparked something unthinkable in the hearts of the galaxy's most powerful species. The ripples caused by the human meal had grown into waves. Across the galaxy, species once divided by old grudges, vast distances, and different ways of thinking were now questioning their beliefs. The stake of the sun had done what? Centuries of diplomacy, war, and negotiation could not. It had opened hearts and minds. But not everyone was happy with the changes. In the Zerath Council chambers, Zillion sat with a troubled look on his face. It had been weeks since the banquet, and he still felt the weight of what had happened. His people, the Zerath, had always prided themselves on their intellectual superiority. They had spent centuries exploring the stars, unraveling the secrets of the universe with pure logic and reason. But now, after tasting the human food, emotions that had long been buried were bubbling to the surface. Feelings of connection, empathy, and compassion were unsettling to them. It was as if something fundamental about their nature had been challenged. Zillion had hoped his people would embrace these new emotions. After all, he believed that the future of the galaxy rested on understanding one another. But there were still many Zerath who resisted. They saw emotions as a weakness that could cloud their judgment. They wanted to remain detached, free from the distractions of feeling. In the council meeting, Zillion stood to address the group. The room was filled with Zerath leaders, all of them quietly observing the debate. Some of them were deeply disturbed by what had happened at the banquet. Others, like Zillion, could not ignore the possibilities that had been revealed. "We must consider the future," Zillion said, his voice calm but firm. "What we felt, what the humans have shown us, is not a weakness. It is a path forward. The emotional connections we now feel can help us build alliances, create understanding, and forge peace across the galaxy." His words were met with silence. Several of the Zerath leaders exchanged looks of discomfort. Zerath, named Veron, known for his cold logic and dispassionate reasoning, spoke up. "Zillion," Veron said, his voice sharp, "what you speak of is an illusion. Emotions cloud judgment. They lead to chaos. We are a species that thrives on logic. If we give in to these uncontrolled feelings, we will lose our way. Our civilization will fall into disorder." "But Veron," Zillion argued, "we are already in disorder. The galaxy is divided. The Corax still fight wars over ancient grudges, the Vieran live in isolation, and the Vornair believe in superiority over others. What we need is unity, not more war and separation." Veron shook his head. "Unity through emotion is fragile. It can be manipulated. Logic is what keeps us strong." Zillion's heart sank. It was clear that many of his people were still unwilling to change. They feared the very emotions that had been awakened in them. But Zillion knew that he could not turn back. He had tasted the human meal, and he had felt the shift within himself. He could no longer deny the importance of connection. Meanwhile, On the Corax homeworld, the situation was just as tense. The Corax had long believed that only strength mattered. They had built their empire through war, conquering worlds and imposing their will on weaker species. But the human meal had ignited something unexpected in their warriors. Zarnak, the Corax warrior who had first tasted the steak of the sun, was once again sitting in his chambers, reflecting on what had happened. He had always believed that strength was the ultimate power. But now he found himself questioning everything he had been taught. The meal had stirred something within him, feeling that strength alone was not enough. There was something more, something he could not yet fully understand. Zarnak stood up and walked to the window of his high tower, looking out over the sprawling Corax city. The sounds of battle drills and the sight of armored warriors practicing filled the air. These were his people, strong, fierce, and relentless. But for the first time, Zarnak wondered if there was another way. Could there be power in understanding? Could compassion be as strong as brute force? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Corin, a fellow Corax warrior. Also tasted the human meal at the banquet, and like Zarnak, he had felt the same unsettling shift. "I've been thinking," Corin said, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we were wrong all these years. We've spent so much time training for battle, for winning, that we've forgotten about the others, about the ones we conquer. Maybe the humans are right. Maybe there's power in protecting, in understanding their pain." Zarnak nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. We've always believed that power is something to take, but perhaps true power lies in what we give. We are strong, yes, but perhaps we can be stronger together, not just as warriors, but as allies." Corin looked at Zarnak, a small smile creeping onto his face. "We will never be the same again, will we?" "No," Zarnak said softly, "we will not." The realization that had begun in Zarnak's heart was starting to spread among the Corax. The meal had sparked something deep within them, a sense of shared responsibility. They were beginning to see that true strength was not just about dominating others, but about protecting and caring for those who could not protect themselves. It was the beginning of a new way of thinking for the Corax, but the path ahead would not be easy. They had to convince their leaders and warriors that this change was worth embracing. Across the galaxy, the ripple of change was spreading. The Vieron, beings of pure energy, had been watching the effects of the human food on the other species with great interest. Kalter, one of the Vieron's most respected elders, was particularly fascinated by the transformation taking place. The Vieron had never needed food. They had transcended the physical limitations of other species, living on pure energy. But as they observed the emotions that had been unlocked by the human meal, Kaltor began to question their own existence. For millennia, the Vieran had focused on transcendence, seeking to escape the limitations of the physical world. But now, Kaltor wondered if there was something even greater than transcendence. Perhaps there was a deeper connection to the universe that could be found not through isolation but through unity with others. "We are energy," Kaltor said, speaking to the Council of Elders. "We have lived for eons, free from the needs of the physical world, but we have also been alone. The others, the Zrath, the Corax, the humans, they are connected to each other through emotions. We have been blind to this. But perhaps this is the next step for us. Perhaps we, too, must learn to connect." The Vieran elders were silent. For the first time, the idea of connection, not through energy, but through emotions, was being considered. It was a radical thought. The Vieran had long prided themselves on their independence and transcendence. But as they listened to Kaltor, they began to understand. Could it be that the humans, with their simple meals and simple emotions, had discovered a truth that the Vieran had missed? As the days passed, the question on everyone's mind became clear. What was the true nature of strength? Was it power alone? Or was it something deeper, something that united rather than divided? The galaxy had always been a place of war and conquest, but now, for the first time, the possibility of peace seemed within reach. The change that had been sparked by the human meal was not just a passing curiosity, it was a movement. It's a movement that would reshape the future of the galaxy. The Zarath, the Corax, the Vieran, and many others had begun to see the world in a new light. The question of whether to embrace emotion, to embrace connection, was no longer just philosophical. It was a question of survival. The future of the galaxy was now tied to the choice each species made. Would they embrace the power of unity? Or would they cling to the old ways? At the heart of this transformation stood the humans, small, often overlooked, but now seen as the harbingers of change. Through a simple meal, they had shown the galaxy a new way of thinking. A way that, despite the odds, might just be powerful enough to change everything. Across the galaxy, the changes set in motion by the human meal were growing. The Zrath, the Orcs, and the Vieran, once isolated in their ways, were now beginning to question everything they had ever known. The simple meal of steak of the sun had ignited something within them that could not be ignored. Emotions were rising to the surface, and with them, new possibilities for unity. Yet not every species was pleased with this change. Among the stars, the Vornari saw the spreading influence of human ideas as a dangerous threat to their way of life. The Vornari had built their empire on the belief that only the strong should rule, that their traditions of dominance and power were the only path to greatness. They viewed the changes in the other species with increasing alarm. The emotional awakening caused by the human food was seen as a weakening of their well-established order, and the Vornari, fiercely protective of their traditions, were determined to stop this shift from taking root. Nirash, the high commander of the Vornari forces, stood before the council of his people, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The room was filled with tension as the Vornar leaders exchanged nervous glances. Nirosh's reputation as a ruthless and strategic thinker was well known throughout the galaxy. But today, he was not speaking about war tactics or battle formations. He was speaking about the human threat. The humans and their food are infecting the minds of our allies, Nirash began, his voice cold. The Zrath, the Orcs, even the Viernal of them, have fallen under the influence of this weakness. They are beginning to embrace compassion, unity, and emotion. This will weaken them. We cannot allow this to spread. His words were met with murmurs of agreement from the more traditional Vornari. The Vornari had always believed in pure strength, in survival of the fittest. Emotion to them was a distraction, a softening of the will. It made people weak, and they could not allow weakness to spread among the galaxy's most powerful species. Nirash paced slowly, his sharp claws clicking on the stone floor. We must act. We cannot let these alien emotions take hold. We must make sure that the galaxy remains under the control of those who are strong. The humans and their sentimental influence will destroy the order we've worked so hard to build. The council nodded in agreement. Nirush's plan was clear. They would launch a series of covert attacks on human food supply lines. They would target human colonies, destroying their crops and food shipments. The idea was to disrupt the spreading influence of human culture, to prevent the emotional awakening from gaining further ground. But Nirash knew that the stakes were higher than just food. The emotional awakening had already begun to change the balance of power in the galaxy. If the Vornari didn't act swiftly, they risked losing control of the very thing they had spent centuries building, their dominance. And Nirash, ever the strategist, was not willing to let that happen. On the other side of the galaxy, Zillion of the Zarath was meeting with his closest colleagues. The Zarath had begun to embrace the changes that had been sparked by the human meal. Some of them, like Zillion, had come to believe that unity through emotional connection was the future. But others remained wary, clinging to their old ways of logic and reason. I understand your concerns, Zillion said, speaking to the group, but we cannot ignore what has happened. We have experienced something extraordinary. We have felt emotions that were once buried within us. These feelings have the power to unite the galaxy. We cannot allow fear to stand in the way of progress. One of the Zrath leaders, Veron, spoke up, his voice filled with skepticism. And what of the Vornari? What of their refusal to embrace this change? If we show weakness, they will not hesitate to strike. They will see us as unfit to lead. Zillion paused. He knew that the Zarath were at a crossroads. The Vornari had always been a dangerous opponent, and their influence was strong. But the Zarath had changed, and they could not deny the shift that had occurred within them. They had learned that the path to true power was not just in logic, but in understanding. We are not showing weakness, Zillion replied firmly. We are embracing strength in unity. If the Vornari choose to fight against us, they will find that we are no longer just an intellectual force. We are now united in a way they cannot comprehend. And that is a strength in itself. Meanwhile, the Corax were also beginning to change. The warriors, who had once believed that strength alone would see them through the galaxy's struggles, were now questioning their beliefs. The stake of the sun had ignited a spark of compassion within them, and many Corax found themselves thinking more deeply about their actions. Zarnak, the Corax warrior, who had felt the power of the human meal, was leading a small group of Corax warriors on a mission to prevent conflict with other species. The old ways of war and conquest were not enough anymore. Zarnak believed that the Corax had the power to be more than just destroyers. "We must change," Zarnak said, his voice quiet but firm. "We cannot continue to follow the same path. Strength is not just about fighting. Strength is about protecting others, standing together as allies." His comrades listened, their faces serious. They had spent their lives in battle, and many of them struggled with the idea of peace. But the change that had begun within Zarnak was beginning to spread. Slowly but surely, the Corax were starting to think differently. But not all Corax shared this vision. There were those among them who still believed in the old ways, who saw the growing influence of human compassion as a weakness. They argued that the galaxy could not afford such softness. Strength, they insisted, was the only path forward. Zarnak knew that this divide within the Corax could lead to conflict. He also knew that the Vornari would seize upon this division, using it as an opportunity to turn the Corax back to their old ways. It was a dangerous game that was being played. As the weeks passed, the tension across the galaxy grew. The Vornari had launched their attacks on human food shipments, and the damage was beginning to show. The human colonies were suffering, and the once united alliance of species was starting to fracture. The Zrath, the Corax, and even the Viaran were now facing a difficult decision. Would they continue to embrace the new path of unity? Or would they succumb to the pressure from the Vornari and other traditionalist factions? Kelter, the Viaran elder, sat alone in the quiet chambers of their energy hall, meditating. The Viaran had always been beings of pure energy, unaffected by the physical world. But now, Kelter could feel something deep within. The question of connection had become more than an intellectual pursuit. It had become a matter of survival. The Viaran could no longer stand apart from the struggles of the galaxy. The decision was clear. They had to choose whether to stand with the others or isolate themselves. Once again, the Vornari were pushing back against the emotional awakening, believing it to be a threat to their power. But Kelter saw it differently. The galaxy's future was not in war or conquest. It was in understanding. It was in connection, and yet the Vornari were growing stronger. And the tension between the old and new ways was only deepening. Would the Zrath, the Corax, and the Viaran be able to hold on to the unity they had started to build? Or would they be swept away by the storm of fear and resistance that the Vornari had unleashed? The galaxy was on the edge of something new, something powerful. But there were forces strong. Ancient forces that were determined to stop it. The battle for the future of the galaxy had only just begun. The galaxy was on the brink of a great change. The tension between the traditionalist forces, led by the Vornari, and the growing movement for unity, sparked by the simple human meal, had reached its peak. The alliances that had begun to form between the Zrath, Corax, Viaran, and humans were now being tested. On one side stood the forces of logic and dominance, and on the other, the forces of compassion and unity. A battle, not just of armies, but of ideologies, was about to unfold. Nirash, the Vornari commander, had been relentless in his campaign to stop the spread of the human influence. The Vornar had launched a series of covert attacks on human food supply lines, destroying crops and disrupting trade routes. The goal was clear: cut off the source of the emotional awakening and stop the shift towards unity before it became unstoppable. But Nirash knew that the stakes were higher than just food. The human way, a path of connection, compassion, and shared experience, was a force that threatened everything the Vornari had built, sitting at the helm of his flagship. Nirash looked out over the battlefield of stars. His fleet was poised to strike against the growing alliance of the Zarath, the Corax, and the humans. He had expected this moment for weeks, preparing for the final confrontation. It was not just about winning this battle. It was about stamping out what he saw as a weakness in the galaxy. But even as he prepared for war, Narash could not ignore the nagging doubt that had been growing inside him. He had seen the changes in the Corax warriors, heard the voices of the Zarath speaking of unity and emotional strength. His own people, the Vornari, had been so focused on power that they had never truly understood the strength and connection. What if they are right? Narash muttered to himself, but he quickly dismissed the thought. No, he thought firmly. Power was the only thing that mattered. Emotions could never be allowed to take root. The Vornar would crush this movement before it could take hold. Across the galaxy, the Zarath, led by Zillion, were preparing for their own moment of truth. The Zarath had embraced the changes brought about by the human meal. But now they found themselves at odds with the Vornari, who were determined to keep the galaxy divided by old ways. Zillion had spent much of his life thinking with logic and reason. But the awakening he had felt after tasting the human food had changed him. It had opened his mind to a different kind of strength and unity, in understanding, in compassion. But now, as the Zarath faced the threat of war, Zillion found himself torn. His people had long prided themselves on their intellectual superiority, their ability to stay calm and detached. Yet the changes that had begun within them, emotions, connection, compassion, were now the very things that made them vulnerable. Could these new ideals withstand the forces that would surely come for them? We must stand together, Zillion said to the council, his voice steady but filled with resolve. The Vornari will not stop at food. They will stop at everything we've come to believe, but we cannot turn back. We cannot let them tear apart the hope of a united galaxy. If we are to survive, we must fight for this new future. The council members nodded slowly, but Zillion could see the worry in their eyes. They had embraced change, yes, but they were still creatures of logic. Creatures who had spent their lives avoiding emotions. Could they truly fight for something that was not based in reason, but in something far more unpredictable? In the Corax stronghold, Zarnok stood in the war room, his thoughts heavy. The Corax had always been a proud warrior race, relying on strength and battle to secure their place in the galaxy. But after tasting the human meal, Zarnok had seen a different path. Compassion, understanding, desire to protect rather than destroy. These were the new ideals that had taken root in his heart. But the old warriors were still strong, and they were still loyal to the traditions of battle and conquest. There were many among the Corax who felt that Zarnak's new path was a betrayal. They had fought for centuries. They were not willing to abandon their beliefs just because a simple meal had caused a shift in perspective. The division within the Corax was growing, and Zarnok knew that a decision had to be made. "We must choose, Zarnok," said Corin, his closest ally and fellow warrior. "The Vornari will not stop. They will come for us, and they will come for the humans. We cannot afford to be weak." Zarnok looked at his fellow warrior, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. "I do not believe we are weak. I believe we are stronger than ever. But we must decide if we want to continue fighting wars that never end, or if we want to fight for something more, for a future of peace, for unity." Corin's eyes hardened. "And if the others do not agree, then we will fight," Zarnok said, his voice resolute. "But we will not fight for conquest. We will fight for the future, for something greater than ourselves." The galaxy was on the brink of war. But there was one last chance for Pisa Summit, where the leaders of the Zarath, Corax, Viaran, and humans would come together to decide the fate of the galaxy. Eldara Prime, the neutral space station where many important diplomatic events had been held, was chosen as the location. The stakes could not have been higher. The Vornari were preparing for battle, determined to crush the unity that had been sparked by the human meal. They believed that without the division, there could be no order, no control. The Zarath, the Corax, and the Viaran knew that if they did not stand together, their shared dream of a united galaxy would be lost forever. As the representatives arrived at Eldara Prime, tension filled the air. The Zrath were the first to arrive, led by Zillion. Their ship docked in the vast sterile bay of the station, and Zillion stepped off, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He had always believed in the power of reason and logic. But now he was seeing that perhaps reason alone could never achieve true peace. He hoped the others would see it too. Next, the Corax arrived, their mighty ships dwarfing the smaller vessels of the Zarath. Zarnok stepped off the ship, his gaze determined. The decision he had made to fight for a future of unity was not easy, but it was the path he had chosen. As he walked through the halls of Eldara Prime, he could feel the weight of the future pressing down on him. Finally, the Vieran, beings of pure energy, arrived. Kalter, the elder of their species, floated gently into the conference room. The Vieran had never needed food, never needed the emotional connections that others had. But now, Kalter knew that the future of the galaxy depended on understanding. On reaching across the divides that had kept species apart for so long, the summit began with tense silence. The Vornari, led by Nearash, were already seated, their expressions cold and calculating. The Zrath, the Corax, and the VRN took their places, each of them feeling the pressure of the moment. Nearash stood first, his voice loud and commanding. We cannot allow the galaxy to be ruled by sentiment. We cannot allow emotions to weaken us. The Vornari are the rightful rulers of this galaxy. We have brought order where there was chaos, strength where there was weakness. The human influence must end. Zillion stood, his voice calm but firm. The true strength of a species does not lie in its ability to dominate, but in its ability to connect, to empathize, to understand. The humans have shown us that there is a way forward, one where we can unite, not through force, but through unity. Zarnak followed. The Corax stand with the Zarath. We stand with the humans. We will no longer fight for conquest. We will fight for the future, for a galaxy where we protect each other, not destroy. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Kalter spoke, their voice a soft hum of energy. We have seen the changes, felt the power of connection. The Vjarn have long existed in isolation, but we now see that our future lies with you all. The Vornair cannot win this battle. We must stand together. Nerush's expression darkened, but he said nothing. The Council had made its decision. In the days that followed, the galaxy would begin its transformation. The Vornari, having failed to divide the galaxy, were forced to retreat. The Zarath, the Corax, the Vjarn, and the humans formed a new alliance, one built not on power, but on understanding, and at the heart of it all was the simple act of sharing a meal that had sparked something unthinkable in the hearts of beings who had long forgotten the power of connection. The galaxy was entering a new era. The future was not just about survival, but about unity. And it had all started with a meal from a human, showing the galaxy that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is not strength, but compassion.